What do you do with your money when you're fearing for your life, but you don't want to spend it in case you live, but you don't want your enemies to take it in case you don't? You bury it. I'm sure you've heard of the infamous gangster Al Capone, but did you know that once he was arrested for tax evasion, of all things, Dutch Schultz became public enemy number one? So who was he? Dutch Schultz wasn't born with this incredible mobster name. He was named Arthur Simon Flegenheimer and was born on August 6, 1901 in the Bronx borough of New York City. His parents were Herman and Emma New Flegenheimer. They were German Jewish immigrants, divorced in 1910 when he was only 9 years old. Because of this, Arthur dropped out of school in the 8th grade and got a job to help support his mother and younger sister. He worked several jobs over the next 5 years before he joined Schultz Trucking in the Bronx in 1916 and stayed there for the next 3 years. He worked several jobs over the next 5 years before he joined Schultz Trucking in the Bronx in 1916, and he stayed there for the next 3 years. But working on the different jobs and staying on the grind just wasn't doing it for him. He began committing crimes such as petty burglaries and theft. And it's because of this that he was arrested at the age of 17 and sent to prison. He was sentenced and served 17 months. And when he was released in December of 1920, he went back to work at Schultz Trucking. But when it comes to his life of crime, this was just the beginning. At the start of Prohibition, Schultz Trucking began to smuggle liquor and beer into New York City and Canada. It was during this time that he began associating with other known criminals, like Lucky Luciano and Legs Diamond. It was also at this time that he changed his name from Arthur Simon Flegenheimer to Dutch Schultz. And according to Dutch, the reason for this was because Flegenheimer was too long for newspaper headlines. Somewhere along the lines, Dutch and his trucking employer had a disagreement, and he left to work for their Italian competitors. In the mid-1920s, Dutch was working as a bouncer at the Hub Social Club. It was a small speakeasy, which is an illicit liquor store or nightclub, owned by Joey No. The pair ended up forming their own gang and opened up more and more illegal drinking joints around the Bronx. Along with the speakeasies, they also ran bootlegging operations for several bars in New York City. The men were even threatening rival establishments to buy from their gang. And at one point, Dutch had gone so far as to kidnap and torture the owner of a saloon who refused to buy from his gang. Aside from that one brave saloon owner, the No Schultz gang had little resistance as they expanded their illegal empire. Their business thrived in the Bronx, but they still wanted more. And the place they saw that more was Manhattan. So they expanded their operations and moved their headquarters to Manhattan's Upper West Side. But doing so caused a bootleg war with the New York's Irish mob led by Jack Legs Diamond. And this would come to be a deadly mistake. In order to show Joey and Dutch who they were messing with and whose territory they were invading, Diamond ordered a hit on Joey No, and he was gunned down outside of the Chateau Madrid on 54th Street in October of 1928. Initially, he had survived the shooting, but after a month of fighting, he died from what I suspect to be an infection from his wounds. The death of Joey was a debilitating loss. Dutch looked up to him. Joey No wasn't just a business associate, he was a friend and a mentor. But Dutch had other things to deal with, like seeking revenge for his friend's death. So he went out in search of Diamond's close associate, Arnold Rothstein, and took his life as payment for his friends. Arnold was a kingpin of the Jewish mob. So after these events, Dutch continued to clash with rival gangs, but with a much larger and growing business. He was supplying speakeasies in the Bronx with $2 million worth of alcohol and was making some serious money. A few years later, one of his enforcers, known as Vincent Cole, had gone to Dutch demanding he make him an equal partner. But when Dutch refused, Vincent formed his own gang with the endgame plan of killing Dutch and taking over his territory. Well, this led to another gang war, and as fate would have it, Vincent was reportedly killed by one of Dutch's men in 1932. And just a year before then, Jack Legs Diamond also died, again reportedly at the hands of one of Dutch Schultz's men. However, on October 18, 1931, Al Capone, another incredibly well-known mobster, was convicted of tax evasion, and on November 24th, he was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50 grand, and charged $7,692 for court costs in addition to $215,000. And the reason this matters is because once the biggest, baddest dude was put away, Dutch Schultz became the biggest, baddest dude that had to be put away. With Al Capone gone, Dutch Schultz was labeled public enemy number one. And a couple years after they convicted Capone, Dutch Schultz was indicted for tax evasion. However, Dutch Schultz was only indicted and he wasn't arrested at this time. Dutch spent several months in hiding before he ultimately surrendered in November of 1934. In 1935, he was tried twice for tax evasion, but Both times the jury just couldn't convict him. The first time, the hearing ended with a hung jury, which basically means they couldn't all agree, so they couldn't convict him. It kind of sounds like some of those folks just didn't want their favorite speakeasies to go out of business, or just into somebody else's hands, but that's just a guess, not a fact. But then Thomas E. Dewey, who was a special prosecutor of New York, had Dutch indicted on illegal policy racket. During this time, Dutch had a lot of costs to cover for the trials, so he reduced the amount of money that he was paying the men that were running the racket, so that way he could bolster what was called the Arthur Flegenheimer Defense Fund. And as you can imagine, when you're doing a job and they reduce your pay, you're gonna be mad. So his gang got together and declared a strike. They wanted what they were due, and when Dutch didn't bend to their demands, his cash flow dried up. And this subsequently damaged his relationships with his own gang members along with other associates. And just to make it all worse, one of his own lieutenants met up with a Sicilian gangster known as Charlie Lucky Luciano. He was planning to take over whenever Dutch was out of the picture. And while all this was happening, Dutch Schultz wanted to put a hit out on the U.S. Attorney Thomas Dewey. But if this had happened, it would have likely caused a massive law enforcement crackdown, so the National Crime Syndicate unanimously denied the hit. Schultz wasn't happy about their decision, and decided he would kill Dewey anyway. Dutch was getting reckless, and this was a serious hazard for his associates, so they hired the group known as Murder Inc. to take out Dutch Schultz before he could do any damage to the organized crime of New York. This is where Dutch Schultz had a airproof and waterproof tight case made where he kept his like button and his subscribe button. Whether he feared being killed or going to jail is not clear, but regardless, he had this safe made where he put an estimated $7 million along with bonds and gold. Now, supposedly he and his personal bodyguard, Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz, drove to an undisclosed location in Phoenicia, New York, where they buried the safe. And on October 23rd, Dutch, Rosenkrantz, Otto Berman, and Abe Landau were having dinner at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. It was a quieter afternoon when Dutch excused himself to go to the restroom, and unbeknownst to him, 2 Murder Inc. hitmen had entered the building. Their names were Charles the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss. And upon his return, the 2 men opened fire on the Schultz gang, hitting all 4 of them before they fled. Now, none of them immediately died, but after they were rushed to a hospital later on, they'd all pass away in the next few days. Before his passing, Dutch was read his last rites and baptized by a Catholic priest before he had gone into surgery. He was hit in the spleen, stomach, colon, and liver. He held on for a solid 4 hours before inevitably succumbing to his injuries and died at the age of 33 on October 24th, 1935. Before his death, he gave a series of ramblings and odd statements, but never revealed his killer. The entirety of what was said is so long that it would add a couple of minutes to the video in just reading alone. So I'm just going to read a part of what was said and leave it up on the screen at the end of the video if you'd like to read it all. But just so you know, not all of it makes hardly any sense. And here it is.
I'll get you the cash out of the box. There's enough in it to buy 4 or 5 more. Lulu, drive me back to Phoenicia. Don't be a dope, Lulu. We better get those Liberty bonds out of the box and cash them. Wonder who owns these woods. He'll never know what's buried in them.
A lot of people think of New York and they picture the hustle and bustle of the busy city life, but there's actually a pretty good-sized wilderness in New York, and Phoenicia is one of those places. There's a lot of variations to this story, and it's difficult to tell which one's the real version and which one is just a red herring trying to throw you off the treasure's true location. But some things that lend credibility to the treasure's existence alone is that Dutch Schultz wasn't like other gangsters. He was very tight-lipped about his wealth, and he didn't spend it like everybody else did. He didn't have a lot of flashy clothes or a really expensive car or even a giant mansion like you would picture a mobster had. He was very frugal, and he only spent a lot of money when he needed to bribe somebody. So if he never spent all of his money, it had to have gone somewhere, right?
Not only this, but in each variation of the story, Phoenicia is mentioned over and over. One version states that 50 years after these events, an old man had seen Dutch and Rosenkrantz stop at the Phoenicia Hotel before they went back a block and turned on Route 214. Somehow, he also knew that the men traveled north along the Stony Clove Creek for about 8 miles, and that they stashed the safe beneath the skull-shaped rock formation known as the Devil's Face before returning to Phoenicia early that afternoon. But hey, it's a place to start if you really want to go looking for Dutch Schultz's treasure. Or if you prefer the comfort of your home, then check out this video YouTube thinks you'll love, and I'll see you there.